Hi, everybody. I think I've got time for one more tonight. So, Shaking the Nickel Bush by Ralph Moody. We have Chapter 14. Leave me try it. I was a little nervous when I carried the clay model into the bank, and I grew more nervous as the old banker looked it over. Well, he said at last, it's me all right, but doggoned if I don't have kind of a naked look. Guess I was used to seeing that old picture with the beard. Wasn't much of the time back there wasn't much of the time back there 50, 60 years ago when I didn't wear one. I swallowed a couple of times and made my best pitch. Did you leave your mustache on when you shaved your beard off? I asked. Yep, he said quickly. Left it on 10, maybe 20 years. Let's try putting a mustache on, I said, and see if it looks more natural to you. He looked at me as if I'd said I'd grow a mustache on the model, and asked, could you do it without spoiling what you've got now? That was enough to let me know I hadn't muffed the job entirely, and my fingers were steady when I reached behind the V of the uniform for a bit of clay. I rolled it into a pigtail between my palms with one end tapering off a little, thick, stuck the heavy end under one nostril of the model, then pressed it down till it extended below the edge of the lip. The old gentleman had his face right at my elbow, watching me like a coyote watches a prairie dog he's about to pounce on, so I said, you could help me a lot if you would. Of course, I don't know how big your mustache was or just how you wore it. If you take hold here with your fingers, you could show me. Smooth it out and twist it just as you did with your own mustache, and if there's more clay than you want, just pinch it off. The old fellow was a bit too gentle with his fingers when he started, but he picked up the feel quickly, curved the pigtail down past the corner of the lip, flattened it with his thumb, and turned up a little ducktail at the end. It wasn't a very good mustache, but he was as tickled as if he'd created a masterpiece. Now we got it, he chuckled. Lord's sakes, all these years and I never knew I was a sculptor. Mind if I try the other side? I didn't. I scooped out a bit more clay, rolled another pigtail, and passed it to him. He had a little trouble in trying to make that side match the other, but I was able to straighten it out fairly well when I marked the hair on. While I was doing it, I asked, did the girl who called you about this tell you it would take me 2 or 3 days to make the marble-like casting? Yep, Mabel told me, he said. Understand you're going to stay around for a couple of weeks. She tells me most of the bankers this side of the state line want their likenesses made. I was careful not to let the banker see how excited his news had made me, and tried to act as casual as I could while I drew the carrying sack down over the model. Yes, I told him, you people in this part of the country have treated us so fine, and we like this climate so well, that we've decided to stay over for a couple of weeks. I doubt we can make busts for most of the bankers between here and the state line, but we'll do as many as we can. Of course, I was thinking, as many as we can get, but I said the last word only to myself. Then I thanked the old gentleman for the help he'd given me on the mustache and left. When I came out of the bank, I noticed a little knot of people standing in front of the general store and Shiftless parked at the side of the street just beyond them. Lonnie wasn't in there, so I expected he'd be in the store buying his new shirt and jeans. I stepped right along with the intention of going in to find him and hurry him along. If we were going to get as much business as the banker thought, we'd have to drive right to Safford for more supplies. I'd have to get some better materials for making armatures, tell the man at the building material yard to order in 3 or 4 more sacks of fired gypsum, and buy shellac and alcohol for hardening and finishing the plaster busts. And somewhere I'd have to get a hold of a lot more modeling clay. I was so busy thinking about the things I'd need that I didn't notice Lonnie until I turned to pass the knot of people in front of the store. He was the center of attraction, leaning one shoulder against the building, his back half toward me, hat pushed onto the back of his head, a bundle under his arm, and his feet crossed in a nonchalant manner. As I stopped at the edge of his audience, he was saying, my partner, he does the temporary clay stuff and cleans out the insides of the molds. My part of the artist business is making the castins, the finished product, you know. We don't make 'em for ordinary folks, only for bankers and such like. It seemed a shame to break in on Lonnie's enjoyment, but I was afraid that if I let him go on, he might get us into a tangle. So I started around the outside of the crowd, stopped as though I'd just noticed him, and called, oh, partner, we'll have to be moving along. We've got a lot to do today. When I spoke, the people looked around at me, and Lonnie was quick in doing the honors. Folks, he called out as if he were selling patent medicine, this here's my partner, the man I was telling you about, cowboy artist of the Southwest. He sauntered over to Shiftless, climbed in behind the wheel, and reached for the goosing wire while the cowboy artist of the Southwest twisted her tail. Lonnie gunned Shiftless down through the street as though he'd been Barney Oldfield out to set a new world speed record. We were a mile out of town before he'd let her slow down to 25. Then, without looking toward me, he said, look, buddy, I was only telling them folks how you make faces out of clay and make molds on 'em, and how I pour in the stuff to make the castins. Fine, I said, but I wouldn't tell them too much. You know, a man that tells all his secrets doesn't stay in business long. Oh, I wasn't giving away no secrets, buddy, he assured me. Only telling him how we done a few things. You know, the folks in these small towns don't see artists every day, and you can't blame them for being curious, like. Where are we bound for? Back to camp? Our trip to Safford took all morning and part of the afternoon, but I found most of the things I needed, and the man at the building material yard said he'd order the gypsum for me right away. The one thing I couldn't find was the one I needed most, clay that was fit for modeling. The nearest I could come to it was a few shovelfuls of adobe mud that some Mexicans were using for making brick. I think Lonnie was still worried for fear I'd heard more than he wanted me to when he'd been talking to the crowd that morning. He didn't have much to say, either coming or going, and he didn't pester me to let him buy stuff for shiftless. After we got back to camp, he kept busy till dark, scrubbing away at her speckled layers of paint. I kept busy enough myself. I made 3 new armatures with good heavy bases, 2-foot pieces of pipe for pedestals, and heavy wire rings at the top. Then I pressed a mass of adobe onto each one of them about the shape of a man's head, but only 2/3 as large. By letting it harden and bake in the sun, I was sure it would make cores that I could use over and over, and would let me stretch my clay far enough that I could have 3 or 4 busts in the molds at the same time. I'd simply have to wet the core each time I reused it, and work half an inch or so of clay over the outside to make my models. Our little canyon was ideal for my work. There was never a time of day when part of it wasn't in bright sunshine and part in shadow. I changed into my working clothes and was starting on the first armature when it came to my mind that there had never been a time since I'd come to Arizona when I could do as Dr. Gagan had told me. Get as much sunshine as possible on my body. It seemed to me that if we were going to be in the canyon for a couple of weeks, it might be a good time to start. Before I went on with my work, I pulled off my shirt and undershirt, then took out my jackknife and cut the legs of my jeans to about 6 inches long. I'd finished the second armature and was working on the third when Lonnie came around and asked to borrow my knife. He didn't mention my having stripped down and cut the legs off my breeches, and I didn't think to tell him why I'd done it. I'd forgotten about Lonnie's having borrowed the knife and was working with my head down when he laid the jackknife by my hand and asked, "Ain't there some kind of funny caps artists wear too? I seen pictures of 'em." When I looked up, Lonnie stood there, stripped to the waist, and with the legs of the breeches I'd given him for Christmas cut even shorter than mine. I had to bite my tongue to keep from laughing, but I couldn't let myself because he was as serious as if it were a matter of greatest importance. "Oh, those are berets," I said. "Only the professional artists wear them." He looked down at me in a rather puzzled way for a moment or two and said, "Well, buddy, we're professionals, ain't we? We're doing it for money." I had to stop and do a little thinking before I could answer him. He was certainly right about a man's being a professional if he earned his living through some form of art. But my work was terribly amateurish as compared to Yvonne's or the busts I'd seen in museums. Then, too, if Lonnie was going to talk his head off every time he could scare up an audience, I knew I'd have to be awfully careful what I told him. "You see, it's like this, Lonnie," I said. "There are 2 kinds of art, fine art and commercial art. The kind that they have in museums is fine art, carved in marble or cast in bronze. Our kind is commercial art. You know, we make ours out of plaster. It's only the artists who do fine art and who wear berets." "Oh, I see," Lonnie said. "Never did know before there was so many different kinds of art. Suppose it's like horses and cattle. Different folks likes different kinds." Then he went back to scrubbing the paint off shiftless. When I'd finished with armatures, I cleaned the isinglass sections, put the dividing dam carefully onto the clay model of the second banker, and mixed a pan of plaster for the mold. I tossed a couple of dollops onto the eyes and ears when Lenny called, "Hey, buddy, ain't you going to leave me sling some of that stuff at the old buzzard?" He slung so hard that he splattered plaster back against his own chest, but he was having too much fun to pay attention to it. With each fistful he'd hoot and laugh, but as soon as the clay was covered, he lost interest and went back to his first love. After supper, I brought Mabel's little horse head from the ledge where it had been drying all day in the sun, took mallet and chisels from the car, and sat down by the fire to chip the mold off. I was a bit nervous, for I'd never before tried using Castile soap to keep the casting from sticking to the inside of the mold. If it hadn't sealed all the pores in the mold tightly, I couldn't break it away clean. The casting would, of course, be ruined, and I'd have to do the whole job over from scratch. I cut the burlap bands that bound the 2 sides of the mold together, ripped them off, and decided I'd better start at the crest of the neck where there would be the least chance for any binding. I stood my chisel edge close to the crack left by the isinglass dam, tapped it gently with the mallet, moved it along a bit, and tapped a bit more. It didn't take much tapping till a little half-circle of brittle mold cracked free. When it lifted out freely, I could see the smooth, clean plaster of the casting, and my nerves went jangly, the way they will after a near accident. I let my arms hang loose till my hands stopped trembling, then went on with the chipping. Piece after piece, the mold cracked free, uncovering more and more of the casting. Lonnie sat across the fire, watching me until I had half of the neck exposed. Then he got up and wandered away toward Shiftless. I was too busy to pay attention to him until I heard a clanking as he sat down at the fire again. When I looked over, he had the mold with the casting of the banker's bust inside it perched on his lap face up. In one hand he held his old carpenter's hammer he used for fixing Shiftless, and in his other hand a half-inch chisel. "I can do this stuff all right, buddy," he told me. "It's just like shelling nuts, ain't it?" I managed to stop him just before he swung the hammer up to wallop the chisel. I must have shouted at him, for his voice had an injured tone when he said, "Jeebers creepers, buddy, I wouldn't do it no hurt. I was only going to shell off some of this molten." I tried to explain to Lonnie that breaking away the mold was a real ticklish job, and that I'd ruined 3 or 4 castings before I'd learned how to do it without marking or cutting them with the edge of the chisel. "Jeepers, buddy," he told me sadly, "you won't leave me do nothin' 'ceptin' to pour in the stuff for the castin's. How am I going to be an artist if you won't leave me do some of it?" It seemed to me that maybe I was being a little rough on him, and it wouldn't make too much difference if he did scar the back of the head a little bit. I'd have to trim the parting place and the hair of that one anyway to make up for the ridge he'd scraped out with a mixing spoon. It wouldn't take much extra work to fill in a couple of chisel marks, and the patches wouldn't show in the hair anyway. "All right," I told him. "I'll let you try your hand on the back of his head after I've made a starting place for you, but you'll have to learn to do a perfect job before I let you touch a face." "Look, buddy," he said earnestly, "I've used a hammer and chisel ever since I was a little kid. We was homesteaders, and my old man used to leave me help him make chairs and tables and stuff." Lonnie's feelings were hurt enough as it was, so I laid the horse head down, got up, and went around to sit beside him. I took the big mold into my lap, turned it face down, stripped away the burlap bindings, and picked a spot that I thought would be right above the damaged parting place. After Lonnie had passed me his hammer and chisel, I marked out a half circle at one side of the isinglass crack, no bigger than half a silver dollar. "That's as big a chunk as you want to take out at one time," I told him. "You don't try to chop it out with the chisel, you just crack it loose and pick it out." As I talked, I stood a corner of the chisel edge on the mark I'd scratched and tapped it with the hammer. "You don't really hammer it at all," I said. "You just sort of bounce the hammer on it as if you were bouncing a marble. Then you follow on around, tapping it a little more. It's that bouncing tap that cracks it loose, not the cutting." "I get you, buddy, I get you," he told me anxiously. "Leave me try it." I didn't let him try till I'd cracked out half a dozen chips. Every one of them came away clean, but I'd started a bit too far back to uncover the damaged parting place, and Lonnie was becoming more anxious with every chip that cracked away. I put the mold back into his lap, passed him the hammer and chisel, and told him, "Just take it slow and easy. It doesn't make a bit of difference whether or not we finish taking these molds off tonight. I've told them it might be 2 or 3 days before the finished pieces were ready. Suppose you crack a little chunk out just above the last one I took." Lonnie clutched the hammer and chisel as though he were afraid someone would steal them. Instead of laying the chisel for a little chunk, he laid it for a big one. Then he tapped it as if it had been a railroad spike. I was lucky. The casting had been drying only a single day, and even in Arizona sunshine it hadn't dried enough to become brittle. But it's lucky that old banker's head was only a plaster cast. A chunk of brittle mold flew past my face. I ducked, and when I looked back there was little more than the handle of a chisel sticking up through the top of the old gentleman's pate. Lonnie was sitting and staring down at it the way a hypnotized cow will stare down at a coiled rattlesnake. "Jeepers, buddy," he whispered, "I've ruined it." That's one time I believed him, but when I examined the casting, there wasn't a single crack running out from the chisel. It had gone through as cleanly as it would have gone into a bucket of lard, and best of all, it had gone lengthwise of the damaged parting place. That was the last of Lonnie's active practice at his new profession, except for pouring the casting plaster and heaving a handful or two of mold plaster into the face of them old buzzards. Those first castings came out better than I'd dared to hope they would. When I'd trimmed and sanded every rough spot and closed Lonnie's brain incision, they looked reasonably near professional. The coating of shellac and alcohol took off the stark white look, and though they didn't look like marble to me, they did to Mabel and the banker. Mabel must have nearly bankrupted her boss with long-distance phone calls, but she certainly saved Lonnie and me from bankruptcy. And if she wasn't the best salesman in the world, she was close to it. Right from the beginning, she was anxious to see how I did my work, so one afternoon Lonnie and I brought her out to our little canyon. She kept as quiet as a hidden fawn as she sat for a couple of hours just watching me shape the clay with my fingers. And I had to be a bit of a hypocrite while she was there. The tintype I'd picked up that morning was a particularly poor one, but the banker's face had been a strong, well-chiseled one. I knew exactly how it must have looked in his early 30s, and all the work I did was from the picture I could bring up before my mind, but every few minutes I'd take the tintype up and act as though I were studying it, and make some little change in the clay. After that first time, Mabel came to our camp almost every day, but she never came alone. She always brought along some nice old gentleman with a tintype in his pocket. A few of them had come more than 100 miles to have me make likenesses of their youth. Each one of them came back when I had the clay model ready, liked it, and came for the finished bust when I had it completed. It saved me days of traveling time, and by working early and late I could just about finish one bust a day. My biggest trouble was with Lonnie. With nothing to do but scrub paint off Shiftless, he wanted to sit around and talk all the time, and his talking nearly drove me crazy. After I'd stood it a couple days, I gave him $20 and said, "We can afford it now. Why don't you drive Shiftless to Safford where you can get a garage man to help you put her into first-class shape?" Lonnie grabbed the 20 and was away within 3 minutes. He always came back to camp every evening, and I know he spent all the money I gave him on Shiftless, for he had some new part on her every time he came back, but it cost me just about $10 a day to keep him out of my hair. Lonnie and I lived in our little canyon for more than 3 weeks, and when we pulled out for the last time, no one could have guessed that we were the same two boys who had pulled in there, or that Shiftless was the same old flivver. Really, she wasn't, and she'd cost me about $50 more than if I'd bought her brand new. Lonnie had put so many new parts on her that there was little of the original jalopy left except for the chassis. He'd done a cracking good job at painting her, and he kept her polished till she shone like patent leather. But it had hurt his feelings that I wouldn't let him letter her front door as the cowboy artists of the Southwest. We'd been living high on the hog, according to Lonnie. Steak, baked potatoes, and dessert for him every day, and for me, chicken, eggs, plenty of milk, and canned salmon. At the end of our first week, we'd gone to Safford and bought whole new outfits of clothing. Levi's shirts, underwear, boots, and hats. Lonnie wouldn't pick out either boots or hat till I bought mine, then took exactly the same thing, only that his hat was 2 sizes larger and his boots 2 sizes smaller. He even insisted on buying Levi's that were 6 or 8 inches too long and then folding the cuffs up the way I did mine. His were only so we artists might look as much alike as possible, but I had a good reason to keep mine folded up. There were 3 $50 bills and 2 20s in one of them. I'd still been a little pasty looking when we settled down in the canyon, but when we pulled out I was as brown as tanned calf skin, except for a white band around the middle. I'd been to see the doctor every week and had mailed the report cards to Dr. Gagan. Each of them had been almost exactly like the sample one I was still keeping, just in case I might have to take another one sometime. If I wasn't a lot stronger than I'd been when I left home, I certainly felt as though I was, but I couldn't seem to gain an ounce no matter how high we lived on the hog. Every bust I'd made had been from a picture, usually an old faded tintype, but I hadn't let myself become confused by trying to copy them. For me, it was better to study the old gentlemen's faces when I visited with them for half an hour or so. In that length of time, I knew all I needed to know about the shape of a nose, the size of an ear, type of eye, breadth of forehead, and general shape of the face and head. But I knew a lot more than that. I knew exactly what sort of man he was in his old age, so it wasn't hard to guess what he must have been like as a young man. For a man's character doesn't change after he's 30. It only becomes more firmly set and is more deeply marked in his features. In shaping the clay for the first 2 or 3 busts, I'd had to close my eyes and bring back to mind some young face of the same type, one I'd known well. But from there on, I didn't have to close them at all. As soon as my fingers began shaping the clay, I could see the man I'd been talking to that morning, but I'd see him as he used to be before the lines of his face had deepened and set. And with each one I made, it was easier to see and easier for my fingers to make the clay say what I wanted it to. The busts weren't fine art, and I didn't try to claim it for them, but they made a good many gentlemen happy, and they made Lonnie and me a right good living. When we crossed the line into New Mexico, I had a dozen letters tucked away in my toolbox, letters I knew would get me a customer in almost any town with a single banker. And that is the end of Chapter 14. Thanks for listening. Bye, everybody.